The Sun is the star at the center of the solar system. It is by far the most important source of energy for life on Earth. Solar energy arrives as light in particles of energy known as photons. When these photons reach the atmosphere, land, and water, some are transformed into another form of energy, heat, that warms the Earth and the atmosphere, drives the water cycle, and causes the currents of air and water. Some photons that reach plants are transformed into photochemical energy used in photosynthesis. Ecological processes involve the transfer of energy. We will explain the pathways and constraints that characterize energy flow through the ecosystem. But first, we must examine the physical laws governing the flow of energy. The laws of thermodynamics govern energy flow. When wood burns, the potential energy lost from the molecular bonds of the wood equals the kinetic energy released as heat. The second law of thermodynamics states that when energy is transferred or transformed, part of the energy assumes a form that cannot pass on any further. Thus, entropy increases. Entropy is the reduction in potential energy. When a coal is burned in a broiler to produce steam, some of the energy is dispersed as heat to the surrounding air. This also happens to energy in the ecosystem. As energy is transferred from one organism to another in the form of food, a portion is stored as energy in the living tissue, whereas a larger part of that energy is dissipated as heat.
There are other factors that affect primary production. As already explained, primary production is the amount of light energy converted to chemical energy by an ecosystem's autotrophs in a given time period. Therefore, it should be obvious that the amount of standing biomass will directly affect primary production. Standing biomass is the total biomass of a given area at the present time. Ecosystems with greater standing biomass have greater net primary productivity. However, this is not the case with marine ecosystems. Phytoplankton are the dominant net primary producers in open water ecosystems. These species are short-lived with high rates of reproduction resulting in constant turnover of the population. Fast turnover of the population results in low standing biomass. Another factor that affects primary production is energy allocation. Individual plants have a limited amount of resources to devote to growth, reproduction, and maintenance. Therefore, where the plant decides to allocate its resources will affect the net carbon gain, which in turn affects primary production. For example, a condition in an ecosystem causes the moisture to be reduced. This results in the plant allocating its resources towards the roots at the expense of the leaves. If plants were to allocate its carbon energy to non-photosynthetic tissues such as stems and roots instead of its leaves, the leaf area is reduced and so will the net carbon gain. Primary production also varies with time and age. Plant growth and photosynthesis are directly influenced by seasonal variations in environmental conditions. Regions where there are cold winters or dry seasons have a period of plant dormancy. Dormancy is a period of arrested plant growth. It is a survival strategy that plants use in times in which they are unsuited to grow. During plant dormancy, primary productivity ceases. Net primary production is the energy available to the heterotrophic component of the ecosystem. When energy in the form of plant material is consumed by an animal, some energy is assimilated and the rest passes from the body as waste products. The energy assimilated is distributed to different functions such as heat, metabolism, maintenance, and respiration. The energy left from those functions is distributed to production, which is growth of new tissues or the production of young. This net energy of production is called secondary production. Secondary production depends on primary production for energy, therefore primary production serves as a constraint to secondary production. As consumption of primary productivity by herbivores increases, so does their production of biomass. Hence, primary productivity is directly proportional to secondary productivity. This is the general relationship between primary productivity and secondary productivity. Although throughout a variety of terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems, there is a considerable variation with the efficiency in which consumer organisms transform energy into secondary production. These variations can be illustrated through a simple model of energy flow. Assimilation efficiency is the amount of assimilation divided by the amount of food ingestion. Production efficiency is the measure of how efficiently the consumer incorporates assimilated energy into secondary production. Basically, it's the amount of consumer production divided by the amount of assimilation.
Eutrophication is a process that can happen in a water body, like a river or lake, when too many nutrients are added to the system. Eutrophication starts when fertilizers, which are rich in nutrients like nitrate and phosphate, are washed into the river or lake system. This leads to an increase in nutrient concentrations in the water. The nutrients are food for algae, and the algae grow and reproduce quickly, forming a thick green bloom in the water. This algal bloom will absorb sunlight shining on the water, so the sunlight can't reach the bottom. Plants who need this light to photosynthesize will die. The algae will also start to die when they eat up all of the nutrients and run out of food. Next, bacteria start to break down the dead plants and algae, and that releases more nutrients back into the water, continuing the algal bloom cycle. The bacteria, with a continuing supply of food, reproduce into much larger numbers, consuming oxygen as they grow and respire. There's not much oxygen in the water to begin with, so when the bacteria consume it quickly, it might run out completely. Water without oxygen is called anoxic. If the water turns anoxic, all non-bacterial life in the water, including fish and other animals, will die. So, eutrophication happens when nutrients are added to water, which causes an algal bloom, cutting off sunlight and feeding bacteria. The bacteria use up oxygen in the water, which becomes anoxic, causing everything living in the water to die. Eutrophication is one reason why we need to be careful with fertilizers when we're growing crops.
Carbon is one of the most important elements on Earth. All living things are made of carbon. Most of the fuels that humans use for energy are primarily made of carbon, including the food we eat. Gases made from carbon, such as carbon dioxide, play an important role in regulating climate. Biological activity causes carbon to be constantly converted among different forms and locations. These movements of carbon are referred to as the carbon cycle. The global carbon cycle describes the exchanges of carbon between the atmosphere, terrestrial vegetation, soils and organic matter, ocean, and fossil fuels. These exchanges are continually changing and not in perfect balance. Human activities are converting oil, coal, natural gas, plant and soil organic carbon into carbon dioxide, which is accumulating in our atmosphere, where it contributes to the greenhouse effect. The atmosphere is a relatively small reservoir of carbon, containing less than 1% of the Earth's total carbon pool. Because it's so small, even a slight increase in inputs to the carbon atmosphere can have a big impact on the total concentration over time. The amount of carbon in terrestrial vegetation is comparable to the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. Vegetation takes carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis. However, the amount that humans continue to add through fossil fuel emissions is more than plants are able to use, so it accumulates in the atmosphere. The CO2 that plants are able to use becomes new plant tissue. Most of the plant tissue winds up naturally dying and falling to the ground to become plant litter and eventually is decomposed or transformed to soil organic matter. In many parts of the world, organic matter accumulates faster than it decomposes, adding to soil carbon pools. Within the soil, there is more than twice as much carbon locked up in organic material than there is carbon in the atmosphere. Human activities such as land use changes and greenhouse gas emissions accelerate the conversion of soil carbon to carbon dioxide. So why is this important? Carbon dioxide is a major greenhouse gas, which causes heat to be retained between the Earth and the atmosphere. Some radiation leaving the Earth's surface is trapped by greenhouse gases, causing heat to be retained. This happens because CO2 absorbs outgoing infrared radiation and re-emits it in all directions, including back down to the Earth's surface. This leads to increased temperatures in the lower atmosphere, which in turn can increase the rate of decomposition, which further increases the amount of atmospheric carbon. This creates a magnifying cycle of increased warming and increased atmospheric carbon. It's important to understand the overall exchanges of carbon to understand this process.
As energy in an organism moves to another, a model is used to track down the energy transferred from the plant to the subsequent organism that consumed it. A food chain is used as an abstract to simulate such an event. The primary producers belong to the first trophic level. The herbivores, first level consumers, belong to the second trophic level, and the carnivores, or the second level consumers, to the second trophic levels. Omnivores, depending on the organism they consumed, will vary to the trophic level they are placed in. In ecosystem energetics, there are two main types of food chains: the grazing food chain and the detrital food chain. The grazing food chain is defined as the classic unidirectional food chain that comes from plants, consumed by herbivores or omnivores, then consumed by carnivores and omnivores. Meanwhile, in detrital food chains, dead organic matter is the primary producers. The herbivores and decomposers, such as fungi or bacteria, acts as the first level consumers, then are consumed by the carnivores. In the detrital food chain, in contrast to the grazing food chain, is not unidirectional, since the dead organic matter can be recycled from any of the trophic levels, and therefore can be linked with the grazing food chain as well.
So you have seen plants make their own food. Other animals eat plants, and some other animals eat those animals who eat plants. So all are dependent on plants. This is also called food chain. It starts from plants. In food chain, plants are known as producers as they produce food. The species who eat plants are called primary consumers, and the species who eat species dependent on plants are called secondary consumers. Now, there is one more part of this food chain. These are fungi and bacteria in soil. When animals die, these fungi and bacteria in soil decompose their dead bodies. They become nutrients. These nutrients again are used by plants to make food. See here, when lion dies, its body is decomposed in soil by bacteria and fungi, and it turns into nutrients. Then, these are again used by plants. These fungi and bacteria are called decomposers. Decomposers are an important part of food chain. Let us see other food chain. Here, rat eats acorns fruit, which comes from plant, and snake eats rats. Eagle eats rat. Eagle dies. It gets decomposed, and plants use decomposed nutrients to produce fruit. The
A short burst of speed, and the outstretched claws of the young lioness stop it in its tracks. But then something unusual happens. could be the full bellies or the childlike curiosity. But these young lions decide to play with their food before killing it. Eventually, hungry or not, the inevitable has to happen. Despite its brave bursts of speed, this wildebeest calf is doomed by primal feline instincts. Even in a time of plenty, they are unable to resist a free lunch.
Was a male elephant, and the carcass was still fairly intact. We remained a distance away and observed that there were lappet-faced vultures and white-backed vultures. The vultures were waiting for some scavengers to actually open up the carcass so they could start devouring the contents.
The great circle of life. What begins must have an end. The leaves and plants that lay lifeless in this backyard become a buffet for creatures like the pillbug. Decomposition is part of the natural order of things. This process consists of organisms breaking down the dead and decaying parts of the environment and reducing it to base nutrients, then returning it to the living ecosystem. This has kept forests and pockets of nature going for millions of years, a self-sustaining way of life. Pillbugs, earthworms, snails and millipedes form an important component of the larger decomposer fauna. All of these animals return organic matter to the soil, where it is further digested by fungi, protozoans, and bacteria, hence making nitrates, phosphates, and other vital nutrients available to plants. The true masters of the soil are the earthworms. Their sole responsibility is to filter the soil and create a rich and fertile soil composition for plant life to flourish. Most earthworms feed on undecayed leaf and other plant matter. Others are more geophagous, feeding on clay and soot to filter out the nutrients from other more harmful sources of food in their environment. The soil excretions that the earthworms produce are nearly 10 times more nutrient-rich than the surrounding topsoil. It is well worth it to have a few creepy crawlers in one's garden. There are other keepers of the soil, the gastropods. Snails and slugs creep slowly along their course, gnawing on dead foliage with their teeth that wear down after great use. Their mucous membranes need very wet environments to allow their top-heavy bodies to move around at, well, a snail's pace. Despite the slug's curvy, obtruse appearance, its exterior is actually almost completely symmetrical, with the exception of its pneumostone, or breathing pore, where it takes in oxygen to its single lung. The mucus secreted by the foot contains fibers which provide traction for the slug when climbing steep surfaces. It must be busy all year round for these decomposers. The seasons change in the blink of an eye, and many plants will not survive the next spring. Through these organisms, these factories of nutrients and crucial minerals, life can carry on to the next generation of plant life in the ecosystem, so that balance is maintained.
Different ecosystems host different cycles of food chain. For example, those in a forest has a detrital-dominated food chain because of a lower percent of herbivores consuming plant biomass, while those in an aquatic environment have a grazing-dominated food chain due to high percentage of herbivory. The biomass of organisms in an aquatic environment differs to those in a terrestrial ecosystem because of the heavy grazing of larger and longer-lived zooplankton to the short-lived and smaller phytoplankton. Energy can be transferred from one trophic level to another, but not all of its energy is transferred. A reason for this is that the ingested biomass of the organism has undergone assimilation and respiration, therefore losing most of the energy. Some of the energy itself is turned into waste. A rule of thumb used by ecologists is that only 10% of the current trophic level is transferred to the next or higher levels, thus making those in the higher trophic levels receiving less compared to those below it.
Now, from where this energy come from? Most of the living species use sun's energy. This energy is transferred to body via food they eat. Sun gives light energy, which is used by plants to make their food by photosynthesis. These plants are eaten by primary consumers and energy is transferred to them. Now secondary consumers eat these primary consumers and energy is transferred to them too. So does giraffe get all the energy from plant which plant gets from sun? Or does lion gets all energy from giraffe which giraffe gets from plant? The answer is no. Actually, 90% energy is lost when it passes from one part of chain to other. Like 90% energy is lost when giraffe eats plant. Similarly, 90% energy is lost between lion and giraffe. Look at this pyramid. It is called energy pyramid. This shows that energy available becomes lesser and lesser as we move on the top of food chain. To understand energy pyramid, let's assume plants absorb 1,000 units of energy from sun. When giraffe eats it, 90% energy is lost, so giraffe only gets 10% of energy. This means energy transfer from plant to giraffe is 105 of 1,000 units of plant energy, which is 100 units. Now when lion eats giraffe, 90% energy is again lost, and lion gets only 10 units of energy. So now
Ecology energetics is all about how energy flows from one trophic level to the next. We have learned about the properties of energy and the laws that govern it. We have learned of its major role in the life of all organisms, from plants, animals, and even microorganisms. Each one plays a role vital to the survival of those in the food chain. We have learned of how the producers tap the different resources around them in order to convert energy into food. The consumers then take in the food and pass the energy to the next one in line. Humans too play a role in all of this. We are also part of the food chain, for we depend heavily on other organisms for food, and the change in the flow can affect our diet and lifestyle. Ecology energetics applies to our work and our everyday life, especially in what we eat and in the field of agriculture, livestock, aquaculture, to name a few. That is why, as rational beings and individuals who have the chance to make better use of the things around us, we should also be mindful of what we do. We should not misuse our resources and abuse our privilege in being able to utilize the environment. We should always take into account the possible consequences of our actions, not only to ourselves, but also the effect it could have on others, especially the environment.